Brownfield, I might not.
Yeah. This committee is now called to order. Good morning and welcome to the first of a two-part series on security cooperation with Mexico and Central America under the framework known as the Merida Initiative. As you all know, violence at the hands of drug cartels along our southern border continues to affect our own security, as well as cross-border commerce. Our communities are threatened by organized criminals who traffic drugs, money, weapons, and human beings across our border, just as they continue to threaten security and governance in Mexico and the rest of the region. Mexico is our third largest trading partner, and we are Mexico's largest trading partner. By the way, Mexico is Arizona, my home state's #1 trading partner. So it's fairly clearly in both countries' national interests that we cooperate to defeat these destabilizing and ruthless drug cartels. Since the 2007 signing of the Merida Initiative, Mexico and the United States have been doing just that, working together to disrupt and dismantle the drug cartels, working to improve Mexican and regional justice systems, and to strengthen our shared border to include air and maritime control. As we approach the 5th anniversary of the signing of the Merida Initiative, I wanted to take this opportunity to take an honest look at our efforts in cooperation with Mexico, evaluate the effectiveness of the full range of counter-narcotics efforts, and determine how we move forward to improve and make better use of of our taxpayer money. With the PRA back in power in Mexico, under recently elected President Enrique Peña Nieto, there will be some changes to our cooperation with Mexico. So I've asked our distinguished panel of government witnesses to provide us with details about what these changes are likely to be and how they will affect our efforts. I'd like to know whether our law enforcement and intelligence agencies will be able to effectively combat drug trafficking organizations under what I understand to be a move more towards centralized control under the Mexican Interior Ministry. And to what extent will this centralization, the possibility it may derail the productive working relationships formed over the last 5 years between our men and women in the field and their Mexican counterparts. The second panel of private sector experts will give this subcommittee their unvarnished view of the Merida Initiative over the last 5 years, and we hope to learn their views on the effect the changes under the new Mexican administration will have in achieving its original goals of the Merida Initiative. I look forward to looking closely at Pillar 3 of the current framework, building a 21st century border, and hearing their experts' views on how we can improve border security so we can protect our citizens without hampering our vibrant trade relationship with Mexico. As chairman of the Subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere, I've chosen to focus on opportunities for economic growth and energy independence throughout our region, and these opportunities around the United States and Mexico. Unfortunately, the scourge of transnational drug trafficking organizations will disrupt these opportunities if the United States and Mexico don't cooperate to take down the cartels and enforce our laws. So I'm committed to doing all I can to make security cooperation between the U.S. and Mexico on solid footing as it can possibly be with our shared commitments. I also want to thank Secretary Brownfield of the State Department's Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, Mr. John Feely, the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, and Ms. Beth Hogan, the Senior Deputy Administrator for Latin America at USAID. I'd also like to thank the witnesses who will testify in our second panel, Ms. Clark Sealk from the Congressional Research Service, Mr. Stephen Dudley, the Director of Insight Crime, and Dr. Francio Gonzalez, a Latin America expert from Johns Hopkins. Thank you all for being with us today for what I know will be an informative and very productive hearing. I'd like to recognize the ranking member for opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Today's discussion comes at a critical time for both the U.S. and Mexico. For the U.S., it comes at the heels of President Obama's recent visit to Mexico and Central America earlier this month, a time when the threat of spillover violence by drug trafficking organizations in Mexico along our southern western border has escalated, and at a time when the U.S. Congress is reviewing its financial commitment and considering historic immigration reform impacting over 11 million people. For Mexico, it comes nearly 6 months after the historic return of the PRI. On December 1st, 2012, PRI candidate Enrique Peña Nieto was inaugurated for a 6-year term, vowing to focus more on reducing violent crime in Mexico than combating the drug trade. In particular, President Peña Nieto has aimed to refocus the nature of the U.S.-Mexico relationship to center on an economic and energy reform agenda while calling for a review of the current U.S.-Mexican security strategy. Thus far, Peña Nieto has moved to centralize security policy, an indication that he is far more skeptical of the nature of U.S. involvement in Mexico's security than previous President Calderón. Yet President Peña Nieto moved to reform the structure of Mexico's security structure by placing the federal police and intelligence service under the authority of the Interior Secretary could be a significant setback in cooperation between an array of U.S. and Mexican federal agencies. Similarly, efforts to centralize police commands and create a militarized police force to replace current military forces engaged in public security could undermine law enforcement cooperation. Nonetheless, maintaining strong cooperation between the U.S. and Mexico is paramount for both our nation's economy and national security. Our nations share common democratic values and similar desires of peace, economic prosperity, as well as a common border extending nearly 2,000 miles. Additionally, the U.S. is Mexico's largest trading partner and largest foreign investor. Mexico, the 14th largest economy in the world, is the 3rd largest U.S. trading partner after Canada and China. Combined annual trade between our two nations is $460 billion. In this regard, and as part of the Merida initiative, both countries have accepted a shared responsibility. The U.S. Congress has appropriated more than $1.9 billion of fiscal year 2012 towards the Merida initiative. For its part, Mexico has invested nearly $10 for every $1 committed by the U.S. As of September 2012, Mexico had invested over $10 billion towards the Merida program. Mexico, however, remains a major producer and supplier of illegal narcotics to the U.S., including heroin, meth, marijuana, and cocaine. More than 60,000 deaths have resulted from drug-related crime and violence in Mexico between 2006 and 2012. Although more positive than not, indications of progress have at times been mixed. For instance, we have helped to train more than 7,500 federal and 19,000 state justice sector personnel, 4,000 of which are federal investigators that did not exist before. Yet those suspected of involvement in organized crime can be held by authorities for up to 80 days without access to legal counsel. Hence, many inmates await trials as opposed to serving out the sentences. Normally, the U.S. Agency of International Development has concentrated most of its work in support of judicial reform at the state level. In terms of human rights, there is concern that the Mexican military has committed more human rights abuses since it has been tasked with carrying out public security. The U.S. must continue to work with Mexico to improve their institutions to investigate and prosecute human rights abuses and strengthen protection for human rights defenders. In conclusion, the landscape in Mexico has changed politically, economically, and in terms of security. But the need to continue combating drug trafficking organizations and stem the violence from their activities remain a mutual concern. I look forward to hearing from our panelists and on their assessment of our individual and joint effort in regards to the Merida initiative thus far and how both our respective nations can improve our efforts moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to also recognize the most distinguished Ileana Ros-Lehtinen from Florida.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much, Mr. Ranking Member, for holding this important hearing regarding one of the most critical partnerships that our nation enjoys, that with Mexico, our ally to the south. In a speech in 1984, President Ronald Reagan said, quote, "Closer to home, there remains a struggle for survival for free Latin American states, allies of ours. They valiantly struggled to prevent communist takeovers fueled massively by the Soviet Union and Cuba. Our policy is simple. We are not going to betray our friends, reward the enemies of freedom, or permit fear and retreat to become American policies, especially in this hemisphere, end quote. And still many years later, we are still looking for a coherent strategy on how to advance U.S. interests in the region, how to promote democracy, how to better hold accountable those regimes that oppress their own people. And that's why I'd like to thank my friend from New Jersey, Albio Ceres, for joining me in introducing our bipartisan legislation, H.R. 1687, Countering ALBA Act of 2013, which urges the president to sanction those persons who are officials or acting on behalf of ALBA governments who are responsible for or complicit in the commission of serious human rights abuses against citizens of ALBA countries, and I hope that we can move that bill forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this hearing.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Chairman Salmon, and of course, Ranking Member Ceres, for convening this hearing today to discuss the current status of the Merida initiative. I look forward to hearing from our distinguished witnesses here today, all of whom are very involved and very knowledgeable on the subject of the Merida initiative and all of Latin America. And I believe the Merida initiative is an essential policy tool to facilitate cooperation between the United States and our southern neighbor, Mexico. The Merida initiative allows the United States and Mexico to maximize our respective resources by coming together with the common goal to fight transborder crime, organized crime, and corruption. Building the capacity for rule of law and providing technical assistance and law enforcement training are important aspects of this agreement. I was pleased to see the initiative grow from a bilateral security agreement with Mexico into a key component of a broader regional security strategy. U.S.-Mexico relations do not exist in a vacuum. It is vital that this agreement continues to complement a broader U.S. regional engagement plan. Addressing the security concerns of Mexico does not stop at a simple bilateral relations. The United States must address the region as a whole. The Caribbean-based security initiative, the Central American Regional Security Initiative, and the Colombian Strategic Development Initiative, along with the Merida initiative, contribute to a comprehensive regional approach that accounts for sophisticated criminal networks and complex cross-border threats throughout the hemisphere. I look forward to hearing particularly from my good friend, Ambassador Brownfield, who could possibly speak about the importance of regional partnerships, particularly when discussing the work of Colombia as a regional partner for many countries, including Mexico and Guatemala. Through my recent travels to the region, I heard firsthand the impact of U.S. assistance in a variety of sectors. Aspects of U.S. security and assistance agreements that address the needs of vulnerable populations such as women, indigenous people, and Afro-Colombians are particularly important. These populations are routinely exploited by criminal networks and armed conflicts. They are all too often the unheard victims of a lack of rule of law and diminished civil society. By building a U.S. engagement strategy that accounts for the integration of ethnic minorities and disenfranchised persons, the United States can work with partner nations to lay the foundation for a safe and secure region. I look forward to hearing again from our witnesses on how we can further advance the needs of vulnerable population through these critical partnerships. The people of Mexico, the people of the Caribbean, the people of Central and South America can benefit greatly from continued U.S. support and assistance that is based on a broad regional vision for shared security, prosperity, and between the United States and our southern neighbors. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing the testimony.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from America and Samoa, Mr. Falimavega.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do also want to thank you and our ranking member for convening this important hearing, and I certainly want to extend my warm welcome to our witnesses this morning. Mr. Chairman, it goes without saying that the U.S. does have a significant interest in the security of our neighbor to the south. Statistics have shown that when Mexico is safe, our own communities in the U.S. are also safe. I applaud the efforts of the current administration in supporting Mexico's endeavors to reduce its elevated rate of crime, violence, and drug trafficking. I also want to note, in fact, and want to associate myself with the comments made earlier by my good friend and colleague from New York, and I associate myself in particularly the interests that we have taken to find out what Mexico has done in its treatment of the indigenous populations there in Mexico. I say this as one of the ironies, Mr. Chairman, that we've celebration of the Cinco de Mayo recently. One of the things that maybe many of our fellow Americans are not aware of. A gentleman by the name of Benito Juarez was a pure Indian, indigenous Indian, was orphaned, raised by monks, and came through the ranks and becoming eventually the president, the Lincoln and George Washington of Mexico, in fact, when they tried to get rid of French colonialism at the time. And that's the reason why the Cinco de Mayo is in reference to the leadership and the services of this indigenous Indian by the name of Benito Juarez, who's revered and honored throughout Mexico. My question is, have the indigenous peoples in Mexico been provided proper treatment by the central government for all these years? And I definitely will be asking more questions concerning this matter. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'd like to turn to our witnesses. First, I'd like to welcome Ambassador Brownfield. It's a wonderful opportunity to have you again. I'm very looking forward to what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Normally, I would defer to my regional colleague to speak first and give us some basic orientation, but Mr. Feely looked so fierce this morning. I will take advantage of this opportunity and then step out of the line of fire before he speaks. Chairman Salmon, Ranking Member Sires, members of the subcommittee, thank you very much for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss U.S.-Mexico security cooperation under the Merida Initiative. I do have a written statement which I will, with your permission, enter into the record and provide this brief oral summary. Members of the subcommittee, we do not start our discussion of Merida today at point zero, since our two governments agreed in 2007 that we share responsibility for the security threats affecting Mexico and will cooperate in solving them. The United States has delivered $1.2 billion in support and assistance to professionalize Mexico's law enforcement and build capacity under the rule of law. The Mexican government, for its part, has invested more than $10 for every dollar contributed by the United States to these shared challenges, and we have had an impact. More than 8,500 justice sector officials and more than 19,000 federal, state, and local police have received training under Merida. Secure federal prisons have increased from 5 to 14, and their quality has increased even more. The U.S. government has provided $111 million worth of inspection equipment that has resulted in more than $3 billion in illicit goods seized in Mexico. More than 50 senior members of drug trafficking organizations have been removed from the streets of Mexico, and more than 700,000 Mexican students have received civic education and ethics training under the Merida Initiative. Mr. Chairman, this subcommittee should take great pride in its support for the Merida Initiative and what it has accomplished for the American and Mexican peoples. Ladies and gentlemen, a new president of Mexico was inaugurated last December. As with all new governments, the Peña Nieto government came to office determined to formulate its own national security strategy and place its own stamp on the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship. The new government has sent some clear signals on the direction it wishes to go. It wants a single point of contact in the Mexican government to coordinate Merida Initiative programs and operations, and greater focus on crime prevention and economic and social development. It wants greater engagement by Mexican state and local government and a sharper focus on human rights. It wants to strengthen the Mexican Attorney General's office, professionalize the police, and build a new gendarmerie to lift some of the policing burden from the federal police and armed forces. Mr. Chairman, I have no problem with these signals. They are logical, they are coherent, they are good ideas. There are a number of details yet to be defined, but what we have now is fully consistent with our strategic approach to the Merida Initiative, where we support the 4 pillars, shift focus from equipment to training, and transition from federal to state and local institutions. As the President said in Mexico City 2 weeks ago, it is the people of Mexico who decide how we will cooperate in Mexico. We have made an unprecedented and historic start to cooperation under the Merida Initiative during 2 different administrations in both Mexico and the United States. I expect to report even more progress to this subcommittee in the months ahead. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Feely.
Thank you very much, Chairman Salmon, Ranking Member Sires, members of the committee. I hope I don't look too ferocious this morning. Bill has a tendency to exaggerate. I also thank you for the opportunity to testify along with my colleagues on the U.S.-Mexico security relationship and the Merida Initiative. It has been my privilege to serve at our embassy in Mexico on 2 occasions. First, in the days and months after 9/11, when we were forced to re-examine how neighbors must confront the horrors of terrorism in democratic societies. And most recently, as I welcomed some of you to Mexico from 2009 to 2012, as our Charge d'Affaires and our DCM, when our Mexican partners and we truly transformed our security and commercial relationships in service of the American and Mexican people. I must thank as well the U.S. Congress for its consistent bipartisan strong support of the U.S.-Mexico relationship in general and the Merida Initiative in particular. Merida is a success story, and this committee's commitment to and stewardship of this new paradigm in bilateral cooperation has been a cornerstone of that success. And I would just note that between 2007, when we began this, and current day, there have been over 25 congressional delegations to Mexico. I look behind you and I see some of our staffer colleagues, Eddie Acevedo, Ramon, Mark Walker, Jose Bautista. I also recall John Mackey in another era with whom we worked closely. The cornerstone of our success has been our cooperation. Begun under the Bush-Calderon administrations and reaffirmed and now strengthened in the Obama and Peña Nieto administration, the United States and Mexico cooperate to vouchsafe our mutual security in ways that, quite frankly, were simply unimaginable when I reported for duty in Mexico the first time over a decade ago. This commitment to our shared security transcends political parties, and it extends across both governments. It has enriched and broadened our relationship. As the Assistant Secretary mentioned, on May 2nd, President Obama traveled to Mexico to meet with President Peña Nieto. The presidents reaffirmed their commitment to improving the lives of all citizens and working with mutual respect and responsibility across a broad range of issues. President Obama emphasized our co-responsibility for the violence associated with the illicit flows of drugs, guns, and cash. The Merida Initiative is based on the recognition that our countries share responsibility for combating the transnational criminal networks and protecting our citizens from the crime, corruption, and violence they generate. The 4 pillars that the United States and Mexico agreed to in 2010 and that Presidents Obama and Peña Nieto have reaffirmed remain our flexible organizing construct. Under these pillars, we are accelerating our efforts to support more capable institutions, especially police, justice systems, and civil society organizations, to expand our border focus beyond security to facilitating legitimate trade and travel, to cooperate in building strong communities resistant to the influence of crime in Mexico. Our success is due in large part to the brave efforts of the Mexican government and people to confront transnational criminal organizations. Our assistance has provided crucial support to the Mexican government in its efforts to enhance the rule of law, promote human rights, and advance justice sector reforms while enhancing the bilateral cooperation between our 2 governments through the provision of equipment, technical assistance, and training. As the Assistant Secretary mentioned, President Peña Nieto and his team have consistently made clear to us their interest in continuing our close collaboration on security issues, most recently during the visit. The Peña Nieto government has stated that it intends to give particular emphasis to crime prevention and the rule of law. The United States fully supports this refinement, and I stress refinement, of our strategic partnership, and we continue our ongoing transition from major equipment purchases toward training and capacity building together. Mr. Chairman, working together, we have truly transformed the bilateral agenda. Our efforts to address crime and violence and enhance citizen security will continue to evolve and will reflect the views and priorities of both governments. Mexican authorities agree that our cooperation must continue and that the Merida Initiative provides a flexible framework for this partnership. Mr. Chairman, thank you and the members of this committee again for your support of the Merida Initiative. Your support has helped make this a catalyst for a dramatically improved relationship beyond just security. I look forward to continuing the work with this Congress, and I will be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Feely. We have a couple of votes that we need to take, but I'd like to have you, Ms. Hogan, make your statements first, and then we'll recess, and then we'll come back after the two votes, and I apologize for inconveniencing you.
Thank you very much. Chairman Salmon, Ranking Member Sires, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I'm grateful for the subcommittee's interest in USAID's contributions to the Merida Initiative. USAID considers insecurity related to high levels of crime and violence in Mexico to be a grave threat to the remarkable development advances of recent decades. Analysis in Latin American countries indicates that high levels of crime and violence are a leading constraint to economic growth because it discourages international investment and drains domestic resources. Since the inclusion of Pillar 4 within the Merida Initiative in 2010, we've worked alongside our Mexican partners to prevent crime and violence in areas that have been most affected by narco-trafficking, with a particular focus on at-risk youth. We do so by helping to create safe urban spaces for youth, provide them life and job skills, increase their access to educational opportunities, improve the ability of government to keep citizens safe, and strengthen the capacity of communities to address the root causes of crime and violence. Because communities along the U.S.-Mexico border are especially vulnerable to drug trafficking, we're developing and testing models to reduce crime and violence in 9 communities in the cities of Ciudad Juarez, Monterrey, and Tijuana. As we identify successful approaches, the government of Mexico is poised to bring them to scale in other parts of the country facing similar challenges. We're tapping into the expertise of countries and cities that have successfully addressed gang violence and reduced crime. For instance, through an agreement signed last year with Los Angeles, USAID is sharing that city's successful gang reduction and youth development approaches with our partners in Mexico. We've also shared other U.S. experiences in crime prevention, such as the ceasefire models employed in Chicago and Boston. We're also partnering with the private sector to make our efforts more sustainable. For instance, we're working with Intel and Prudential in the cities of Monterrey and Tijuana to train at-risk youth from tough neighborhoods for productive employment in the technology and construction fields. Our effort to reach at-risk youth is already bearing fruit. In Ciudad Juarez, approximately 88% of the youth who took advantage of our program re-enrolled in middle school. In Tijuana, 70% of our enrollees are either back in school or employed 6 months after program completion. And the 9 focus communities have all developed community master plans, which will help them make the best use of local resources to reduce crime and violence. Because insecurity thrives in environments where corruption is rampant and impunity emboldens criminals, we're continuing our longstanding efforts through Merida to strengthen the institutions charged with ensuring the rule of law and the protection of human rights. We work closely with Mexican justice institutions as they transition from a closed inquisitorial criminal justice system to a more open and transparent accusatorial one. A 2012 impact study conducted in 5 states implementing justice reforms indicated that they were already having the desired effect. States reported a marked decrease in pretrial detentions and case backlog, in large part due to an increased use of alternative dispute mechanisms. Victim assistance units have been strengthened, and serious crimes are receiving longer sentences compared to states that have not yet implemented justice reforms. Mexico is scheduled to enact these reforms nationwide by 2016, and we are poised to help them in that effort. Through Merida, we are also supporting the government's efforts to prevent, protect, and advocate for human rights. In 2012, we trained more than 150 journalists and human rights defenders on practices and technologies that can help protect them and their work. We're also supporting human rights training for federal and state police officers in the government's new Victim Assistance Unit. This includes supporting master's degrees for 300 police in human rights and developing training curricula that incorporate internationally recognized standards. In addition, we're partnering with local organizations on campaigns to prevent torture and support the implementation of human rights reforms. Mr. Chairman, the government of Mexico has been a full partner in our shared endeavor to reduce crime, support youth, strengthen the judicial sector, and advance human rights. Our main interlocutors, including the Undersecretary for Human Rights and the Undersecretary for Crime and Violence Prevention, and SETEC, which is the government agency that oversees justice sector reform, have all expressed their interest in not only continuing, but expanding our close working relationship. We look forward to continuing to partner with them as they press ahead with their ambitious reform agenda. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. This committee will be in recess until we commence our voting. Thank you. This subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere is reconvened. I'd like to thank the distinguished panel for their testimonies and the time that you've allocated to be with us here today. Assistant Secretary Brownfield, as of March 13th, roughly $1.1 billion of the $1.9 billion in the Merida funding appropriated between FY 2008 and FY 2012 had been delivered. I understand at least $95 million in 2012. Merida funding remains on hold, and there appears to be between $600 and $700 million in funds yet to be delivered. What's the current status of the Merida pipeline, and should we be concerned that deliveries have been remained largely unchanged since fall of 2012? And are those funds being reprogrammed to align with the shift in priorities expressed by the Peña Nieto government? If so, what should we expect this reprogramming to look like? Finally, how will centralization of security cooperation under the Mexican Interior Ministry affect the on-the-ground efforts and relationships formed and the information and intelligence sharing that is necessary to get ahead of the cartels?
Thank you, Mr. Feely. Excellent questions, and let me try to knock off all of them in some sort of order. Our own calculation is that we have delivered on $1.2 billion of Merida assistance funding and appropriations since fiscal year 2008. And since Congress has appropriated $1.9 billion in INCO money, simple math tells you how much, therefore, remains at this stage undelivered. That would include, of course, about $200 million of FY13, which has not yet come to us at all due to the process. So my own figure is I'm looking at about $500 million that is in play right now. You correctly point to an issue, not the only issue, and that is that we are still working through the directions of, the priorities of, the vision of the new government of Mexico and Enrique Peña Nieto. I signaled for you, as did John, some of the areas that they have identified as priorities. We're comfortable with those areas. We don't yet have a defined strategy that we can say we can program and implement against. We're continuing to work programs that we have had in place for the past several years. You correctly note that a chunk of this money, $95 million, is currently on hold due to the other house here in the United States Congress, and we are working to resolve those issues together with the government of Mexico. Finally, you mentioned one specific issue that we are also working through, and that is the desire of the government of Mexico to have what they call the single window or the single point of contact for coordination of Merida initiative material through the government ministry, the government secretariat, the Secretaría de Gobernación. We are working through those issues. I have no objection to the concept in principle, nor does anyone. It's very logical to have a single point of contact, a go-to person for decisions, but how to implement that on a multi-$100 million program that involves dozens of different agencies and thousands of different people is what we are still working through. We owe you greater clarity on that. We're working it with the government of Mexico. I would hope by the time you call us here again for another hearing, we'd have a definitive answer.
Wonderful. Thank you. I would like to point out that for every dollar that we spend, it's my understanding Mexico spends 10. That's a pretty good bang for the buck. And that probably leads to the next loaded question. I know how important this funding is, but I'd like to ask this question, and any member of the panel or all of you can address it. But given the current U.S. budget constraints, the status of the Merida Initiative funding pipeline, and the fact that Mexico is a middle-income country, is continued aid to Mexico through Merida justifiable? And if you had to pare down, what areas would you argue for maintaining and why? And I apologize, my time's kind of run out, so if there's anything you want to supplement in writing afterwards, that's great too, but I'd love a short response on that.
Mr. Chairman, I will go ahead and start. The funding for the Merida Initiative, as you note, has indeed been on a downward slope. The reason for that, very simply, is that when we began this, we began with some big-ticket items that Mexico desperately needed to improve air mobility, to get non-intrusive inspection equipment to its ports, to get IT platforms, et cetera. As we have provided that leveraged assistance, Mexico, as you mentioned, has spent its own money, and that is right, and that is just, and that's the way it should be. Where we have begun to evolve, even before President Peña Nieto and his team came in, is a greater focus on training, on capacity building. This is the added value that we have by providing FBI agents, DEA agents, our justice sector people. I'll let my colleagues speak more specifically to the sectors, but I would say in general, absolutely, it is still necessary, and the partnership that this has not bought, I don't want to use that term, but the partnership that this has engendered has also had a very positive effect across the rest of the bilateral relationship, not just in the security sector. And you will note that Merida is very much a whole-of-government effort, and we have one of the perhaps unintended secondary consequences of our 5 years now of Merida is that it has engendered on the Mexican side a genuine interagency process, something that, quite frankly, a decade ago didn't exist.
Mr. Chairman, if I could offer from the INCL perspective a set of numbers to indicate that not only do I agree with you, but I think we're moving in that direction. As we learned in Colombia, when your program is successful, part of the price of success is the numbers, the funding made available to you to address it goes down. May I offer you 3 sets of numbers, just mine, I don't speak for Beth from the USAID side, but the INCL funding in fiscal year 2012, we received from Congress $248 million for Merida. In the 2013 continuing resolution, we received $199 million. For fiscal year 2014, we have requested $148 million. The number is going down precisely as you suggested that it should, but from my perspective, it is going down in a predictable and systematic way that I can then plan against, as opposed to having a surprise out there waiting for me at the end of each fiscal year.
And from USAID's standpoint, we are transitioning out of several sectors in Mexico in order to be able to focus and concentrate on Merida and global climate change. We are getting out of health. We have already, in fact, gotten out of the health sector in Mexico. We're transitioning out of higher education and private sector competitiveness. And so our funding requests on the development assistance account have gone down steadily from $34 million in FY12 down to $23 million in FY13, and we see ourselves going down to $12 million in FY14. So we are very much in sync with your observation about the Mexican government being able to fill in that space and lead their own development path in those sectors.
You know, it's actually nice to see programs in government that actually go down over time. That's a good thing. I'd like to recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just follow that for a second, because I am a strong supporter of the Merida Initiative and think it's good. But let me just ask this question, because sometimes what you're trying to do is to convince your colleagues that it's the right thing to do, et cetera. So the first question is, what metrics will does the State Department and USAID utilize to show that the program is successful, that we could then utilize to tell our colleagues this is a successful program and this is how it's been evaluated? Because many say, oh, you just spend money and then, you know, what good is it? You just throw money at it. So can you tell us what the metrics are?
That's such a very important question to be able to track progress as it takes place. I would say that we are very, very focused on monitoring and evaluation of our programs in Mexico as we are globally. And just to give you a couple of examples from the justice sector, the study that I referenced in my opening comments looks at the time in which it takes a prosecutor to resolve a case. In the states that are implementing the reform, we've been able to see that it is taking them less than half the time to prosecute a case that it does in states that have not yet had the reform go forward. We're also tracking the amount of pretrial detention, and we've seen a very sparing use of pretrial detention in states that are doing reforms. You know that Mexico has had a history of having too many people in pretrial detention. Now they're only focusing on those that are at the greatest risk of fleeing. So those are the kind of interim indicators that we're looking at on the justice side. There are many more, and I'm happy to give you examples of those after my testimony. On the on the youth side, when we're talking about how do we know we're effective in our programs with at-risk youth, as I mentioned again in my testimony, we see the numbers that are re-enrolling in school, the numbers that are going on to get licit employment. But we also, at the end of the day, want to be able to show that in the communities where we're working, we'll see a reduced level of crime and violence, because that's the ultimate goal. And so we have done a baseline study in the 9 communities where we're working, and we have that, and by February of 2014, we'll be able to say definitively whether or not those programs have indeed achieved the goal of reducing crime and violence prevention.
And might as well stay with this real quick, because the concerns always are, you know, as we drive crime down, especially in big cities, in the rural areas and other areas where there's not a lot of commerce, et cetera, that's where the cartels and other ones seem to emanate, and those are primarily places where the indigenous and those live, et cetera. So I was wondering, could you tell us, as I mentioned in my opening statement, the effect that the Merida initiative have in regards to helping the plight of minorities in that region or in Mexico? How does that work? Mr. Feely?
I would be happy to take that, Mr. Meeks, and I thank you very much for your consistent companionment in advising how we deal with, in Merida, with indigenous and marginalized populations. First, with regards to just one comment to add on to about monitoring, on April 16th, President Peña Nieto in Monterrey laid out what was the sort of strategic chapeau for what we hope will be the emerging security strategy. And he laid out 6 lines of action, he called them. And very importantly, one of those was monitoring and evaluation. And so we take that as a very positive sign, and we're going to continue to encourage it. With regard to Mexico and the protection of indigenous people and indigenous populations, it's important to note that early in February this year, the new government created the Commission for Dialogue with Indigenous Communities. They hope, and it is our encouragement, that the indigenous communities will be able to have their human rights protected through government attention to their needs, preservation of their right to autonomy and self-determination. This forum will be very important for continuing that. Additionally, since 2003, long before Merida started, the Mexican government has had the National Commission for the Development of Indigenous Communities. This is a semi-autonomous institution created in the Secretariat of Social Development. We support very strongly, and you should be aware that the Merida dollar that the American people put into Mexico very strongly supports, through our public affairs section, working with indigenous communities to empower them in Mexico. We have several programs. One of them is with it's called the Study of U.S. Institute for Scholars, SUSI. We have brought up 60 grantees. We continue to sponsor this program. We also have something, and this is my AID colleagues can speak in greater detail, we have something called the SEED program, which provides scholarships to young people and educators. When I was in Mexico, I had the privilege of presiding over several ceremonies with these people. Probably the most effective thing I've ever seen is to send an educator from the Tzotzil communities in Chiapas to the United States for a community college degree, for training in English, and then see that person return. We've created an alumni network with a special focus on indigenous communities in Mexico. So it remains a very high priority for us, sir.
And I hope that, begging the chairman's indulgence, I just had one. First, let me correct myself so that I don't get the scorn of Mr. Brownfield. I said ambassador, but I forgot he's now an assistant secretary. Mr. Secretary, let me just ask you real quick. Could you speak, as I said in my opening statement, about the importance of regional partnerships, particularly when discussing, you know, the work of Colombia and others in the area, working together to make sure that we, you know, they talk about the tourniquet effect, so that, one, we're not pushing drugs one way because of the networks, and I know you've done this. Could you just tell us that very quickly?
Sure. Congressman, you may call me ambassador whenever you wish. I promise not to be offended. You know where I am on this because you and I have had this conversation a number of times before, and that is we must address the drug issue and the transnational organized crime issue in a regional and hemispheric way. Otherwise, as we have been saying for the last 30 years, we squeeze the balloon in one place and it's just going to expand in some other place. How are we doing it? We have this, in essence, a four-part strategy that involves Colombia in the south, heavily focused on originally planned Colombia and then the Strategic Development Initiative, Mexico at the northern end through the Merida Initiative, Central America in the middle through CARSI, and eventually, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have to pay greater attention to the Caribbean because the logic is, as we begin to bite and take hold in Central America, the Caribbean is going to become an issue. We have some good news here. Colombia clearly is, by everybody's account, a success story. Mexico, Bill Brownfield would argue that we have reached the turning point, and we are, in fact, seeing now on the ground real-life results of the joint effort under the Merida Initiative. Central America, we are now ramping up. The logic that I saw in Colombia for 3 years and for a number of years before is that will begin to bite. We have a partner that we have to make greater use of, although I acknowledge that they have been enormously helpful so far. That is the government of Colombia, which has received over $8 billion of funding provided by this Congress since the year 2000 and are now in a position to export much of that capability. They are doing more police training in Central America than we are. They are doing as much monitoring and surveillance of drug trafficking aircraft and boats in the Caribbean as we are. We are getting, if you will, Dr. Meeks, a return on our investment of the last 10 years.
Thank you very much. Ms. Ross-Lehtinen.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for this excellent hearing, and thank you to our panelists as well. Although other regions often dominate the headlines, Latin America remains central to our country's security and our own prosperity. Mexico is a vital ally in this region. It's instrumental to the economic and security outlook of our country. And given the strong ties and the interests that bind our two nations together, it's important to re-examine the Merida Initiative to ensure that it is living up to its promise of bringing a greater measure of human rights and the rule of law in Mexico as Mexico struggles to address these challenges. According to reports, the new Mexican government has called for an end to direct access by U.S. law enforcement officials with their Mexican counterparts on security matters. I'm concerned that this shift by Peña Nieto could impact our national security. It could hinder mutual security operations regarding narco-trafficking, regarding terrorism. And in addition, I'm concerned that Mexico is not doing enough to protect its southern border, just like the Colombians are training law enforcement and military personnel in the region. Mexican authorities should be doing the same. And with that in mind, we've got to re-examine our own approach to the violent crisis in Central America. Last year, joint operations with our allies in Central America were crucial in disrupting illicit networks, eliminating drug smuggling cells. I'm concerned about the growing destabilizing threat of violence throughout Central America. However, these programs have been frozen for more than a year due to a hold from the Senate side. This undermines our national security. It lets our friends hanging out there to dry. So, Mr. Feely, can you give us a status update on the hold? And I'll ask you to respond when I finish. Also, what is the strategy of the administration regarding this money, given the fact that the reprogramming deadline for Honduras funds is in the beginning of June, in just a few days? And Ambassador Brownfield, you said it was okay to call you that. I'd like to turn our attention to Bolivia for a moment. As we know, in 2008, Bolivia expelled our U.S. ambassador, expelled the DEA. And in 2011, I urged Secretary Clinton to oppose the framework agreement between the U.S. and Bolivia citing that Morales does not want to be a partner of the U.S. He undermines our interests in the region. And just this month, Morales violated the Constitution again by seeking a third term, expelling USAID officials from Bolivia. However, despite all of these expulsions, the State Department continues to fund counter-narcotics operations in Bolivia. The request for Bolivia was $15 million in fiscal year 11, fiscal year 12, $7.5 million, and the administration's request for fiscal year 14 is $5 million. When will the administration realize that our tax dollars can be better spent elsewhere, and is there a plan to change our current footprint? And we'll begin with you, Mr. Brownfield.
Sure, Congresswoman. In fact, I will address the Bolivia question and then turn all of the others over to John. I will not talk to the larger issue. I will talk to the specific issue that you have asked, and that is, what is our plans in terms of the future of INL operations and programs in Bolivia? And you are correct. I have reached the same conclusion that you have. I will tell you that I am proud of what the INL section, called the NAS, down there has accomplished in Bolivia over the last 30 years. I think they have delivered great value for the American people and, for that matter, for the Bolivian people. That said, the time has come for us to go.
Amen.
It is my intention to close down our section in a reasonable and orderly fashion, and I would be stunned were you to see a request for FY15 for additional funding to support INL activities in Bolivia.
Thank you so much. We will have you end right there. Amen and hallelujah. And Mr. Feely, we just have a few seconds, but the strategy about Honduras is, and the hold in the Senate side for all the region funds.
Thank you, Congresswoman. You're absolutely right. We have looked to Honduras as one of perhaps the places with most concern, where institutions are weak, where we have very willing partners, but quite frankly, capacity that needs to be bolstered. You are correct that there is a hold in the other chamber of the U.S. Congress. We have worked with the staff members to explain what we have done in terms of improving the human rights performance of Honduran military and police, what we have done with our own DEA and our own trainers in terms of developing SOPs, standard operating procedures, to be able to provide support to the Honduran police. We have also walked through a significant amount of internal review based on what happened during Operation Anvil earlier, and we have got not just a lot of lessons observed, but quite frankly, a lot of lessons learned. We have taken that process very seriously. We remain engaged. It is a high priority for us to be able to continue to support the government in Honduras because it is one of the most critical places.
Thank you very much to
Thank
both
you.
of you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. Mr. Sears.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, last week, the OAS released a report on drug policy in the Americas, which proposed the notion of legalizing production, sale, and use of marijuana, and urged flexibility amongst the hemispheric nations to deal with the drug problem. You know, it seems to me that it's counter to what we're trying to do. I'm not shocked at the OAS to come up with something like this. But can you just talk a little bit about this, you know, both of you?
Certainly. Let me start. I'll turn over the specific details of the report to Bill. But let me just say that the United States government, as you well know, advocates a holistic approach to drug policy. The report that came out last week was commissioned by the leaders in Cartagena last year in a discussion that President Obama had participated in. They put it into the CCAD, and what they needed was, CCAD being the commission to study drugs in the OAS. We believe that we need a baseline. We recognize that our policy, our holistic policy that looks at the drug problem as a health problem, not just as a criminal justice problem, but also undeniably as a criminal justice problem, one that may have, we have dedicated tremendous amounts of money here, almost $10.7 billion is the request this year, for greater prevention, greater education, alternate routes to be able to deal with drug problems here in the United States. And the request for this report, we welcomed, frankly. We are looking at the report, and I would note that the report does not make a recommendation. It simply lays out several scenarios that could occur if countries were to follow certain routes. And with that, I'll let Bill go a little bit deeper.
Sure. Let's not go into detail on the drug study, Congressman. It's a very long document. It's over 200 pages in length. My simple summary would be the first part of it, the so-called analytical part, was not bad, professionally done. The second part, the so-called scenarios, what might happen if the following things happen, was I found less satisfactory. At the end of the day, the report was not actually the resounding call for legalization that the media has suggested. And I must admit, I went online and I entered in OAS drug study, and the first 15 screens of what I got all had the title OAS calls for legalization of marijuana, which actually was not what the drug study said, but you would have to get to the 16th screen before you would realize that, had you gone online to read it. Here, so you don't have to now. I have saved you a vast amount of searching. We have gone at this and we've made 3 or 4 basic fundamental points. One, all governments of this, of all countries of this hemisphere have signed on to the 3 UN international drug conventions. We all must abide by those because we have ratified them. Second, legalization, the so-called legalization issue, is a matter of national policy. One international body is not going to dictate legalization, certainly not to the United States of America, and I doubt to any other nation in the world. Third, as John just mentioned, the approach to drugs has to be comprehensive and holistic. We have to address all the issues. You don't just get to pick one and say, if we solve that, we have actually solved the problem. I mean, we've tried that in the past. It does not work. And fourth and finally, the United States government, through ONDCP, the Office of National Drug Control Policy, put out a new national drug strategy about 6 weeks ago. It's actually a good strategy. It's different. I recommend that you all take a look at it when you have a moment, because it does attempt to address many of the issues that the OAS drug study identified. Public health as part of the issue, looking at alternatives to the criminal justice system, bringing down demand. These are good ideas. We don't disagree with them, and these are the things we wish we could have a discussion about in the OAS context, as opposed to a somewhat simplistic argument based upon a false premise.
Moving on to the Merida and our efforts, and I know that some people think that it hasn't really reached the Caribbean yet. I would say, I would disagree with you. I think that the real drug movement now comes from the Caribbean. I think they have moved on. I think a lot of the drugs that come into this country and in Europe goes through the Caribbean. I was just wondering if you can talk a little bit about that, because as we make this effort with Mexico and the rest of the countries, I think the balloon has popped already in the Caribbean. So can you?
Dr. Sears, I would never disagree with you. Of course, I acknowledge and agree that the Caribbean is a current problem, and more to the point, a growing problem in terms of drug movement through the region. That, in fact, is my operating assumption. We might differ as to precisely how much is moving through it right now. We do not differ on the fact that, one, it is growing. More is moving today than a year ago. Second, many of the Caribbean states are vulnerable to penetration by large multi-billion-dollar criminal enterprises. And third, we, the United States of America, do not have the resources and assets in the region that we had back in the 1980s and the 1990s, the last time that the Caribbean was overwhelmingly the preferred point of entry for illicit product into the United States of America. And my argument is we had better think about this today when we have some flexibility in terms of how to prepare for this situation than waiting for 2 years when we will be confronting a crisis. I think you and I agree on that, and my own guess is eventually we owe you a clearer vision as to what our thinking is to strengthen the ability and capabilities of the Caribbean states to be able to resist, combat, and eventually defeat this effort in the years ahead.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this very important hearing. Let me just ask 2 questions first to Mr. Feely. On Monday, I chaired a hearing. It was the third in a series on Jacob Ostreicher. On June 4th, it'll be 1 year, 2 years, I should say, that this man has been held against his will, 18 months in the infamous Palomacero prison, and I visited him there. It's a horrific gulag place run by the inmates. Sean Penn made a very interesting recommendation, and the feedback or the backlash in Bolivia in the media and by the leadership there is very telling, and that is to pull support for the Dakar rally and to ask the sponsors to reroute the Dakar rally so it does not include Bolivia. One, it would also mean that people who are a part of it run the risk of being incarcerated themselves, because businessmen and women need to be put on high alert that it is not safe to do business in Bolivia. So will the administration support that? Secondly, in January, and I and 3 other members of Congress, including Mr. Pierluisi, Congressman Pierluisi Pedro from Puerto Rico, wrote a letter to President Obama, then Secretary of State Clinton, Assistant Secretary of State Jacobson, and the U.S. Ambassador to Mexico regarding the extremely troubling case of Dr. Manuel Placer. Dr. Placer is a U.S. citizen from Puerto Rico. He has been imprisoned in Mexico for nearly a year. It is our understanding that upon arriving at the airport in Mexico City in June of 2012, Dr. Placer was arrested and imprisoned by Mexican authorities. He was charged under Mexican law with theft, a crime Dr. Placer alleged to have committed during a prior visit to Mexico in January of 2011. This seems to be nothing more than a commercial dispute, and yet he is being treated like a criminal. We understand that the presiding judge in the case declined to admit into evidence documentation that Dr. Placer was not in Mexico at the time of the alleged crime. We further understand that a federal judge asked to review the case found significant problems with the manner in which the presiding judge handled the matter, and then remarkably sent the case right back to the same judge. In our letter, my colleagues and I strongly urge the U.S. government, through the Department of State, to be proactive in ensuring that his due process and human rights are protected, consistent with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and all other relevant international and domestic legal obligations. We received a response from State in March. To describe it as perfunctory would be charitable. I also note that in February, Congressman Pierluisi and I met with Eduardo Medina Mora, the Mexican ambassador to the U.S., to express our grave concerns. The ambassador, former AG, as you know, did not know of the case, but he pledged to look into it. Months later, nothing has changed. So my question to you, are you aware of that case? What is the U.S. government doing to address the serious concerns that we have raised? Clearly, more needs to be done. The situation is unacceptable. We have a U.S. citizen languishing in a Mexican prison on charges that are commercial in nature, and he has evidently been denied the right to present evidence that shows him to be innocent. He wasn't there. I met at length with his attorney, met with his family. He wasn't there. Now, if that's not true, they're lying, but I don't think they are. The evidence seems overwhelming. And can you pledge to me and to my colleagues that you will look into this matter and brief us, but hopefully take some action? And finally, to Ms. Hogan, in your testimony, you talked about training 150 journalists and human rights defenders. My question to you is, does that also include your definition of human rights defenders? Does it include abortion rights advocates?
Mr. Smith, I'll go ahead and begin. Thank you very much. First of all, in general, let me thank you very much for your very strong advocacy for American citizens detained overseas. You know better than anybody the case of Jacob Ostreicher and the case of Manuel Placer. You also know that we face these situations all over the world, and that the Department of State has as its absolute highest priority the protection of American citizens while they're overseas. We have, in the case of Mr. Ostreicher, as you know, he was released on bail, partial house arrest last year. He is still there. Mr. Mehmet, with whom you've met on multiple occasions and previously with John Kramer, continue to meet with him. We will remain in steady contact. Roberta Jacobson, the Assistant Secretary, is in regular contact with Miriam. We raised this repeatedly. We will continue to do so. We watched with great interest the hearing that you held the other day and saw what Sean Penn had to say. I will tell you that we are looking at that. It is under study. I don't have an answer for you, but we do owe you an answer on that. And I want to just reassure you that the case of Jacob Ostreicher is one that we keep very much. I have a small little checklist that has 3 or 4 names on it. Gross, Ostreicher. Dr. Manuel Placer is always on there. I have a personal connection to this. My wife is from Puerto Rico. I know Pedro Pierluisi for many years before. I have been in touch with him. I've been in touch with Gabriel Guerra Mondragon. You described very accurately what I understand to be the facts of the case. Keep in mind that the American government and our consular officials are not overseas able to take a position on merits of the case. However, ensuring that judicial transparency and a level playing field is granted to American citizens who are incarcerated overseas is our highest priority. Manuel has been visited on a number of occasions by our people. Stay in touch. We have followed the case being remanded back. I can assure you that Ambassador Wayne is aware of this case. Our Consul General, Susan Abeta, in Guadalajara is aware of this case, and we will stay in very close touch with both Congressman Pierluisi's office and with anybody else who's advocating on his behalf. And let me just once again thank you. Mexico is the home to more American citizen prisoners overseas than any other country. When I was in Mexico on 2 occasions, I spent a good bit of my time working these types of cases. You mentioned somebody who will be a key player, and I believe, and I pledge to you that I will raise this with Ambassador Medina Mora. I'll be meeting with him tomorrow. We do a regularly scheduled breakfast to stay in touch. He absolutely is aware of the case because you raised it to him, and we will raise it with him.
Thank you. So
thank you.
Is there time for Ms. Hogan? Could Ms. Hogan answer that question? Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Our human rights protection programs are aimed at those who are at most serious risk of harm based on their exposure of human rights violations that are occurring in Mexico. So in that group, we count journalists, certainly, but also bloggers, human rights leaders who are exposing very serious issues that could come back to haunt them, if you will. Abortion advocates are not part of that group.
I appreciate that clarification. Yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Before I recognize the next distinguished congressman, I'd like to just recognize that in our audience today, we have the police director, General Jose Roberto Riano from Colombia, and I just want to say, job well done. Job well done. Proud to work with you. The chair recognizes the gentleman from American Samoa, Mr. Falema Vega.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and our ranking member again for this very substantive and important hearing concerning our bilateral relationship with the country of Mexico. I hope I won't be redundant in being repetitious in some of the most excellent questions and concerns that have already been expressed by my colleagues, but I will try in somewhat of a hopeful, some fashion, in trying to see if you could, members of the panel will be helpful to me. We currently have a 2,000-mile border relationship with Mexico, and with a trade relationship in excess of $460 billion trade. And in the process, we've taken the Merida initiative having 4 basic philosophical goals and objectives in terms of how we can interact and work closely with the government of Mexico as we have done for the last 4 or 5 years. I'm just curious, I think we have the total population in Mexico now is about 110 million. Am I correct on that? I had mentioned earlier about one of the ironies, and it seems that people hardly hear the fact that Mexico's founding father, the Abraham Lincoln and George Washington, was an indigenous Indian by the name of Benito Juarez from one of the tribes of the Yucatan area as an orphan raised by monks. And despite all the height of bigotry and discrimination that was given against indigenous Indians at that time, Benito Juarez rose above that and eventually became the leader of Mexico, and it was through his leadership that caused the Cinco de Mayo celebrations that we often think about, and the fact that this is how Mexico got rid of French colonialism, and it was through the leadership of Benito Juarez. I say this because I'm just curious, out of the population of 110 million, how many are indigenous Indians? Do we have a statistical data on that, Mr. Feely?
Sir, I'm sure we do. I will confess I'm going to have to get back to you to be specific. What I will tell you is that the vast majority of the population of the 110 to 12 million Mexicans is mestizo. The indigenous populations are primarily concentrated in the 2 southern states, Chiapas and Oaxaca. As you rightly point out, it is an enormously rich tradition, one that Mexicans are very proud of. I do have to get back to you. I would think that it's relatively small, again, because the nature of Mexico and its development in the 20th century and even prior has been one of what they say in Spanish is mestizaje, the mixing of indigenous with peninsulares, the original folks who came from Europe. One thing I will just add is that Mexico, my friend Arturo Sarucan, the former Mexican ambassador here, used to say, if soft power really mattered, Mexico would be a superpower. The richness of the indigenous culture in Mexico simply cannot be overstated. And again, as I mentioned earlier with Mr. Meek's question, one of the pillars of our public diplomacy programming is to reach out to those indigenous communities and give them a platform for not just coming to the United States, but also for showing and preserving the diversity of that culture. But we will get...
I note with interest you mentioned that the President Nieto has set up this commission in February to address the needs and the issues affecting the rights of indigenous peoples. Was this something that started with President Nieto as if this issue or this problem in dealing with Indians, it just seems like it falls through the cracks for the last 100 years, in my humble opinion. Am I correct on this, or correct me if I'm wrong?
No, sir. I think what you see is an evolution and perhaps a heightening of focus. Keep in mind that there has been in Mexico for quite some time a National Commission for the Development of the Indigenous Communities. There have been, as you know, as far back in the Zedillo administration and the Salinas administration in the early 90s, there were serious problems with the indigenous in terms of their rights not being respected, land rights not being respected. Mexico has worked through a difficult time, much in the way that the United States worked through its civil rights issues.
Well, unfortunately, I have about 100 more questions I wanted to ask Mr. Chairman, but I know my time is running out. I'll just have to, I will submit a series of questions in writing. And
I was just going to suggest that if you have any questions in writing, and we're going to have a part 2 of this hearing later at a different date, but any questions you'd like to submit in writing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the members of the panel.
Okay, well, that concludes our opportunity to hear your testimony and our questions, and thank you so much. We just are really honored to be able to work with you and count on us as allies. And it's time for us to change the guard, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
No, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Thank you for your help. Our staffs are working. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, thank you, Ms. Feely. Thank you very much. Great testimony.
Oh, good, good, okay. If he's in the interim, you can go ahead then.
Okay. We're going to proceed with the second panel, and I'm really thrilled. We have Claire Silk. Am I saying that right? Silky? Okay, sorry. Claire Silky is a specialist in Latin America affairs at the Congressional Research Service. CRS is a nonpartisan research agency that serves the members and committees of Congress and their staffs that is located in the Library of Congress. Mrs. Silky came to CRS in 2003 as a Presidential Management Fellow. As part of her fellowship, she completed rotations with the State Department in the Dominican Republic and with the U.S. Agency for International Involvement in Washington, D.C. She currently focuses on Mexico, Bolivia, and Central America with a special focus on security issues. Ms. Silky holds a Master's of Public Affairs and a Master of Arts in Latin American Studies from the University of Texas at Austin. Prior to graduation school, she obtained her undergraduate degree from University of Notre Dame and served as a volunteer in Guayaquil, Ecuador. By the way, my daughter just completed a mission for our church in Guayaquil, Ecuador. So that's kind of neat. Next, we have Mr. Dudley, and let me see. I've got your introduction. Stephen Dudley, Director and Head of Research, Mexico, Central America, and Caribbean Insight Crime. Dudley is a Senior Fellow at American University Center for Latin American and Latino Studies in Washington, D.C., and a visiting fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars. He's the former bureau chief of the Miami Herald in the Andean region and author of Walking Ghosts, Murder and Guerrilla Politics in Colombia. Dudley also has reported from Haiti, Brazil, Nicaragua, Cuba, and Miami for NPR and the Washington Post, among others. He has a BA in Latin American History from Cornell University and an MA in Latin American Studies from the University of Texas at Austin. He was awarded the Knight Fellowship at Stanford University in 2007 and is a member of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. And then finally, Francisco Gonzalez. Dr. Gonzalez is the Riordan Roet Associate Professor of Latin American Studies at the Johns Hopkins University Paul H. Nitz School of Advanced International Studies. Before joining SAIS in Washington, D.C., Professor Gonzalez taught at the SAIS Bologna Center in Italy, and he was a junior faculty member of the University of Oxford's Department of Politics and International Relations in Great Britain. Professor Gonzalez was the recipient of the British Academy Postdoctoral Fellowship, which he served at Nuffield College, Oxford, and prior to that he was a lecturer in politics at St. John's, Oxford. His research interests include the politics of Mexico's democratization process, political impacts of financial and economic crisis in Latin America, and more recently, Europe, transitions to democracy and authoritarian rule, and the growing influence of the Hispanic community in the politics of the United States. Professor Gonzalez is author of 2 books, both published by Johns Hopkins University Press. First, Dual Transitions from Authoritarian Rule, Institutionalized Regimes in Chile and Mexico. Was named Outstanding Academic Title of 2008 by Choice, the magazine for academic libraries. Second, in the spring of 2012, he published Creative Destruction, Economic Crisis and Democracy in Latin America. He's a regular participant in commentary shows on CNN and Espanol, Voice of America, The Diane Rehm Show, and Al Jazeera International. Professor Gonzalez received the Excellence in Teaching Award at SAIS in 2006 and again in 2012. He's one of the few SAIS faculty members to have received this honor twice. Dr. Gonzalez earned his master's 1997, MPhil 1997, doctoral DPhil 2002, degrees in politics from University of Oxford, and his BA in politics and public administration from El Colegio de Mexico 1995. Ms. Silky.
Chairman Salmon, Ranking Member Sires, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the Congressional Research Service. As you requested, my testimony focuses on the rationale behind the Merida Initiative and how the initiative has evolved over time. By the mid-2000s, violence perpetrated by transnational criminal organizations had begun to threaten citizens' security in Mexico. The Merida Initiative was conceived in 2007 in response to then-President Calderon's unprecedented request for increased U.S. support in helping Mexico combat drug trafficking and organized crime. Prior to that time, U.S.-Mexican counter-drug cooperation had been plagued by mutual mistrust. As originally designed, Merida consisted mainly of U.S. training and equipment for Mexican security forces engaged in anti-drug efforts. Congress has appropriated $1.9 billion for Merida through FY12, while the Mexican government invested more than $46 billion in related efforts from 2008 to 2012. The United States also provided extensive intelligence sharing and logistical support for Mexican anti-crime operations. To complement bilateral efforts in Mexico, the U.S. also pledged to address drug demand, weapons trafficking, and bulk cash smuggling. Acknowledging that Mexico could not effectively confront organized crime with tactical victories alone, in 2010, the Merida Initiative evolved to focus on the 4 pillars previously discussed: disrupting organized crime groups, strengthening the rule of law and human rights protections, building a 21st century border with emphasis on the Mexican side, fostering strong and resilient communities through prevention programs and services for at-risk youth. From FY12 forward, the largest amount of funds requested has fallen under Pillar 2 for criminal justice sector reform. There has also been increasing support for justice sector reform and prevention programs at the state and local level. Weak government institutions and underlying societal problems have allowed the drug trade to flourish in Mexico, and many Mexican analysts welcomed the Merida Initiative's shift in focus. Some continue to argue, however, that border modernization and community building programs have been underfunded. In addition, most Mexicans continue to have reservations about the anti-organized crime efforts under Pillar 1 because of the perception that they contributed to record levels of violent crime. On balance, Merida dramatically increased bilateral security cooperation, and efforts under Pillar 1 helped the Calderon government arrest or kill record numbers of criminal leaders. Many of those leaders have been extradited to the United States to stand trial, but few, if any, have been successfully prosecuted in Mexico. At the same time, Mexico also experienced record levels of organized crime-related violence, partially in response to government efforts, as criminal organizations split, fought against each other, and proliferated. As the violence increased, so too did popular opposition to the government's security strategy. On December 1st, Enrique Peña Nieto of the PRI took office pledging to enact bold structural reforms to boost Mexico's economy and to broaden relations with the United States beyond security issues. The overarching aim of his security strategy is to reduce violent crime in Mexico, a goal that President Obama has pledged to support. The Merida Initiative is now being adapted to complement President Peña Nieto's goal of violence reduction. Although that adaptation process may be somewhat slow and difficult, it could be necessary to ensure that U.S. and Mexican priorities complement one another moving forward. 6 months after President Peña Nieto took office, details of his government's security strategy, particularly how it plans to combat crime without exacerbating violence, have not yet been fleshed out. The Peña Nieto government has asked for increased U.S. support for judicial reform and prevention efforts, which the United States has already been providing through Pillars 2 and 4 of Merida. Pillar 3, building a 21st century border, could also dovetail well with his goal of increasing U.S.-Mexican trade. Some are concerned, however, that the Peña Nieto government has limited direct U.S. involvement in some intelligence and law enforcement operations under Pillar 1. So, what are the implications for U.S. policy? As President Peña Nieto implements his security strategy, Congress may wish to examine how the government's priorities align with U.S. interests. Congressional approval would be needed should the State Department seek to reprogram some of the $500 million in funding already in the pipeline from Merida, or shift additional new funding towards Mexico's new priorities. Should conflicts occur between Mexican and U.S. priorities, Congress may consider how those conflicts should be resolved. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for the opportunity to testify before you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Dudley.
Morning. Mr. Chairman, thank you. Ranking member, members of the subcommittee, I'm grateful for the opportunity to appear before you on behalf of Insight Crime and the Woodrow Wilson Center to discuss security issues in Mexico and United States efforts to address these issues through the Merida Initiative. This testimony, I should note, is an abbreviated version of the full testimony which I submitted for the congressional record. Since its beginnings in 2008, the Merida Initiative has, via a series of important programs outlined here by Claire, ranging from prevention strategies to technical assistance and equipment, opened the way for unprecedented cooperation between the two nations. The cooperation helped Mexican authorities capture 25 of 37 designated kingpins severely debilitating several of the large criminal structures. The Calderon government also initiated important judicial sector reforms and started to restructure the country's security forces in order to deal more effectively with criminal organizations. At the same time, Mexico has lived through an unprecedented spike in violence. Homicide rates tripled during President Calderon's time in office. Targets included politicians, police, military personnel, and civilians. The response by military personnel, at least in some cases documented by human rights organizations, was excessive and may have included extrajudicial executions of suspects or civilians. Meanwhile, criminal gangs have fragmented. They have diversified their criminal portfolios and draw much of their income from local revenue sources, such as drug peddling in the increasingly large local drug market, extortion, kidnapping, theft, and other activities. The most formidable of these organizations is known as the Zetas, a military-minded group that is focused on controlling physical territory and has a wide portfolio of activities. It has also grown exponentially during the last few years. Because its revenues come from local criminal activities that can be practiced anywhere and by virtually anyone, the Zetas have created the ultimate democratic model of organized crime. It is a model that can be easily replicated across Mexico and is therefore inherently vulnerable to suffering internal splits itself. Perhaps the most enigmatic example of these challenges that the Mexican government faces, and during the last 5 years of its time, is Ciudad Juarez. Between 2007 and 2011, this city went from about 300 homicides per year to over 3,500 per year. The astounding spike in violence during that period has been matched only by the surprisingly precipitous drop in homicides, which is back down to about 1 per day. There are many ways to explain this drop in violence. The most cited explanation is that in the war between the two largest criminal groups in the area, one became the winner, the Sinaloa cartel. In this narrative, this criminal group is maintaining order in the underworld, something that seems like an oxymoron and hardly sustainable. But in Juarez, the government and Juarez citizens also took action. The government initiated a program aptly named Todos Somos Juarez, We Are All Juarez, a multi-million-dollar educational and violence prevention strategy of the type the U.S. government already assists under Pillar 4 of the Merida initiative. Citizens, with the help of the federal government, have created roundtables that regularly interact with authorities, demanding accountability and results, and fostering greater trust between them and their city officials. These officials include the city's police chief, Julian Lezaola, who many give credit to for the drop in crime and violence. The cornerstone of his policy, however, is to arrest anyone who they see as a threat. Some say these mass incarcerations are a systematic violation of human rights and may lay the groundwork for another round of violence. Finally, it is worth noting increased cooperation between the U.S. and Mexican law enforcement that has also played an important role in the battle for Juarez. U.S. and Mexican investigators from both sides of the border told me that they were cooperating on a more regular basis since Merida began. Agents on both sides said this cooperation has led to real results, including arrests on the Mexican and U.S. sides of the border. For his part, President Enrique Peña Nieto has said he will focus his efforts on reducing violence. But since taking office in December, the president has given only a broad outline of how he will achieve this goal. In some respects, it feels the same as the Calderon strategy. Peña Nieto has, for the most part, left Army troops and federal police in many of the same hotspots where Calderon used them. He has said he will continue reforms, although both police and judicial reform seem to be stalling already under his administration. There are some more subtle shifts in policy. Peña Nieto has reduced the role of the Marines by some 40%. The Army's role also appears to be moving more towards a less confrontational strategy, although evidence of this shift is more anecdotal than quantitative. In another subtle shift under Peña Nieto, the Attorney General's office has reduced the number of drug prosecutions to a 15-year low. In general, you might say that while Calderon tried to bully his way towards a more manageable security situation, Peña Nieto appears more interested in taking a selective approach and possibly reducing the pressure on criminal groups involved in drug trafficking as a way to lower the temperature of this confrontation. Thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez.
Very good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to testify today. I ask that my whole written testimony be made available to the public, and I'll summarize my presentation into 3 points. Look forward to your questions. Point number 1, focused originally on training and the sale of military and police equipment to help Mexico pursue the so-called war on drugs. The Merida initiative had, in my view, a significant and welcome change of focus in 2010 by emphasizing institution building, specifically helping Mexico to introduce the law, the rule of law in the country. Many policymakers, think tanks, policy documents in Washington, D.C. and Mexico City make the mistake of saying that the aim is to help Mexico strengthen the rule of law. This is incorrect. There is and has not been a rule of law in Mexico. I wish that the thousands and thousands of innocent Mexicans in jail had such a good advocate as Congressman Smith, as we heard during the previous panel. Alas, they don't. Creating the rule of law is by far the most important positive medium to long-term contribution that American taxpayers' money can bring about in Mexico. One of the reasons why the early years of the Merida initiative ended up surrounded by controversy was that by providing means to strengthen Mexico's military and police forces, and given the absence of a rule of law in Mexico, complaints of serious abuses started piling up regarding the conduct of Mexico's military and police forces against innocent civilians. Second point, there has been a worsening general perception of U.S. operations in Mexico. A turning point for Mexican public opinion about U.S. help in the war on drugs occurred after a whistleblower uncovered the so-called Fast and Furious operation carried out by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives between 2006 and 2011, which allowed more than 2,000 AK-47 weapons to walk into Mexico to try to arrest kingpins. This operation unraveled after the tragic death due to one of these weapons of a U.S. Border Patrol agent. The Mexican Attorney General has confirmed that some of these weapons have been recovered in crime scenes where at least 150 Mexicans were maimed or lost their lives, but few officials have either from the U.S. or Mexico even blinked an eye. As of February 2012, more than 1,000 of these weapons remained walking around Mexico. Another incident that acted as a significant eye-opener for both Mexican society and the U.S. government was the ambush of a U.S. vehicle with diplomatic plates carrying 2 CIA agents, which came under attack by Mexican federal police forces. In addition, President Calderón allowed U.S. unmanned planes to operate in Mexican territory without even most of his close collaborators knowing about this. For many, Calderón's strategy had gone berserk, and as a consequence, there was a significant public opinion backlash against the no-strings-attached access given to U.S. law enforcement, intelligence, and military forces. Point number 3, it is my view that it is right that lowering the levels of violence, official impunity, and homicides has become the Mexican government's top priority. My own position, after having heard many family, friends, working colleagues, acquaintances scattered around my country, from Mexico City to Morelos to Michoacán to Jalisco to Coahuila to Nuevo León, is that everyday living conditions during the last 6 years have deteriorated significantly. Extortion, almost unheard of among the backbone of middle-class Mexico, doctors, lawyers, economists, engineers, has become endemic in the last few years. A case that helps to illustrate the climate of intimidation that society is under, given the collusion between drug trading organizations and high-ranking members of local, state, federal governments and police and military officers, occurred to someone my family knows well. The individual in question is a prestigious heart surgeon who is well known for his involvement with good causes in his city. A military platoon was sent to take over his house without a search warrant. His crime, his daughter's mother-in-law was a state attorney general who resigned and threatened to go public about systematic corruption and close links between the military stationed in the area and the drug trafficking organizations. The military ransacked, robbed, destroyed, and defecated in the doctor's house. The doctor, an influential individual in the city, went to see the general in charge of the garrison station there. He was told that the action had been just a taste of what could happen to him and his family if his daughter's mother-in-law opened her mouth. Mexican President Peña Nieto's decision to recentralize law enforcement and intelligence functions under the Secretaría de Gobernación is not necessarily bad. The restoration of basic oversight functions centrally is a necessary prerequisite to rein in significant fragmentation bordering on anarchy that Mexico has experienced during recent years. For the record, I am not and have never been a member of any political party. Neither have I ever worked for any government or any public project. I am proud to be a teacher, and my weapons are my reasoning and my independent voice. I think that the most important action that US representatives of tax-paying American citizens can take is to deepen their commitment to help Mexico create the rule of law. The US tradition of open oral trials, presumption of innocence, trial by a jury of peers, and the basic notion of equality before the law are essential if Mexico is to consolidate its democracy and prosperity in the medium to long term. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to have to go vote very, very soon. We have a series of 3 votes, and that's it for the day, and everybody kind of heads off to the 4 wins after that. So I'm going to abbreviate our questions, and then as soon as each of us gets a chance to ask a question, we'll adjourn. But thank you so much. I know there's so many things to talk about, more questions to ask, and I'm sure we'll interface with you again more at other times. But, Mr. Dudley, I'd like to address one particular issue. You noted there's been a major decrease in drug prosecutions by the Mexican Attorney General's office since Peña Nieto took office. In your written testimony, you said that Peña Nieto administration is more interested in reducing the pressure on criminal groups involved in drug trafficking as a way to lower the temperature of this confrontation. In practical terms, are you suggesting that the new Mexican government may be willing to sacrifice actual results for the perception of reduced drug-related crime?
I think, thank you for the question. I think that they're trying to change what those results look like. I think that if they were making the priorities, if they were their priority list may not look the same as the United States priority list. In other words, if the United States has the priority list of getting the 5 largest drug kingpins, for them, if these are not the 5 largest motors of violence, or people who are engendering the type of disruption and violence that is occurring, and that was described very well by Dr. Gonzalez, then perhaps those would be their priorities. So I think it's a shift in priorities, and I don't know about the number of prosecutions. What I can say is the number of cases opened with regards to a specific type of crime, which are very closely related to drug trafficking crimes. They call them crimes against health, literally, but they're mostly drug trafficking crimes. So possession, movement, purchasing, those sorts of things. And those are down to a 15-year low. And then simultaneously with the idea, and in fact some military personnel have said this in public already, that there is a notion of perhaps pulling back a little bit, lowering the number of roadblocks, not going out and having sort of massive sweeps anymore. Maybe it's a more effective way. It's harder to say. Maybe it's more targeted. But you can certainly see those subtle shifts in the way in which they're approaching this.
Thank you. Mr. Sears.
Thank you. Thank you for being here today. Dr. Gonzalez, you don't seem to think much of this effort to centralize the security. Obviously, they pre-ruled for 71 years, and they were pretty much centralized. So I was just wondering if you can just elaborate on that a little bit. Why do you don't think that this is going to? Why do you think this is going to be effective or not effective?
Thank you, Mr. Congressman. I think the jury is still out there, as Mr. Dudley said. I think this approach is less provocative. An analogy would be, it seems like the previous administration, President Calderon's administration, kicked the hornet's nest here, there, and everywhere. This administration seems to want to target operations, and as said before, we reserve our judgment regarding the outcomes. It's very important that there are fewer windows of opportunity where the systematic impunity and corruption that takes place in the country continues to happen. An important example, for example, is the current takeover of the state of Michoacán by a general who's taken over the control of municipal, state, and federal law enforcement authorities. During Calderon's period, each of these three levels of government were doing their own thing. And it's the word in the street throughout Mexico that 80 to 90% of municipal police forces are in the paycheck of the cartels. Likewise, very high percentages of the state police forces. Centralizing it is not necessarily a silver bullet to solve the problem. It at least helps to close down some of those gates through which impunity and corruption operate on a daily basis and allow inexcusable things like the one I related to happen.
Thank you, Mr. Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks, panel. Apologize that we had a lot going on today, but this is an area of interest of mine. We traveled last year in August down to Mexico City and met with the federal police, the military, and Mexico City law enforcement, and understand some of the training. But one thing that concerns me is the new president seems to have pulled back some of the resources from the border. And when we know that's where Americans are concerned, that we're seeing cross-border violence, and we're seeing whatever the number is today of murdered Mexican citizens murdered by the drug cartel in that border region. So, Dr. Gonzalez, I just ask you to comment a little bit about the perception of the president pulling his resources back to a more central location. Is that a positive thing? And it may be. I talked with Undersecretary or Assistant Secretary Roberto Jacobson recently about this from the U.S. State Department's perspective, but I'd be curious to hear your perspective. Is that a strategy that may have long-term positive effects, or do we see some concern of pulling back resources from the border area on the Mexican side?
Thank you for your question, Congressman. The main aim, at least in the short term, is to be less provocative by the current Mexican government. In particular, there is a keen sense that it's very important to restore peace along the border, given the very significant economic relationship that the U.S. and Mexico have, close to half a trillion dollars to 2011, 2012 annually. With some of these places like Nuevo Laredo, like Tijuana, like Juarez, like Matamoros, being the bridges that connect this incredibly vibrant exchange, the government has decided to pull back resources to concentrate first and foremost in the south, the states of Michoacán, Guerrero, maybe start going into Sinaloa, further up in the Pacific, and Sonora, to try to rein in particular, a lot of the gangs that have established deep social roots within the communities. They want to be able to have permanent police and military presence under central control there, to try to root that out. That is also the route where a lot of the methamphetamine comes through. My sense, and again, there are no results, and so the jury is out there, my sense is that the earlier tactic of pulling back from the border is to be less provocative, to allow for a restoration of some social sense of peace among society in the large cities of the border, given the very significant role they play in economic affairs. I don't think they have abandoned the border. I don't think this is the strategy that will be followed for the next 6 years. I think this is part of a strategy. And as I said, currently the idea is to concentrate further down south, where in fact violence has
in the essence of time, I think 40,000 people have been killed in the border region by the drug cartel. Was that because the military or the police forces had provoked the Mexican drug cartel? Were there a large number of that 40,000 that have been killed involved in law enforcement, or were these random cartels fighting one another? And how does a pullback strategy change that situation where the cartels are actually fighting each other? And will we see fewer deaths because of the pullback?
Right.
I'm trying to understand the strategy.
It varies according to cities. Cities like Juarez, for example, violence became so fragmented that there was no line of command. No police chief or military chief could take the phone and call someone on the other side, the leader of a cartel, and say, pull back. Things had become so outsourced, almost on a block-by-block basis, that no one could control violence. Thankfully, that was not the case, or it didn't get to that stage in places like Tijuana. It was on the brink. Places like Nuevo Laredo are still struggling with that. The idea is to, if you want to create cordons sanitaires and not kick the hornet's nest. Many of the death, around 80 to 90%, are drug trafficking cartels fighting over transportation routes, and some officials who've fallen in the line of duty. The idea of creating the cordon sanitaire is to be less provocative, to bring the levels of violence down.
So part of the pullback is just to bring the forces in, build loyalty with the Mexican government, and do away with some of the corruption, kind of gather your forces, understand the loyalty factors, and then come up with